The morning of September 11th, 1973, began like any other Tuesday in the small parish of San Miguel, nestled in the hills overlooking Santiago. Father Andrés Morales had risen before dawn, as was his custom, to prepare for the 6 a.m. Mass. The church bells chimed their familiar melody across the cobblestone streets, calling the faithful to prayer just as they had for over a century. But this morning carried something different in the air, a tension that seemed to cling to the mountain mist rolling down from the Andes. Father Andrés, at 34, was beloved by his congregation. His thick black hair was already showing traces of premature grey at the temples, a testament to the weight he carried for his community. He had arrived in San Miguel 3 years earlier, fresh from seminary, with eyes bright with purpose and hands soft from books rather than labor. The parishioners had watched him transform from an idealistic young priest into a man who understood that faith sometimes meant standing between the powerful and the powerless. The church of Santa Teresa was modest. Whitewashed walls, wooden pews worn smooth by generations of worshippers, and stained glass windows that painted rainbow fragments across the stone floor when the morning sun hit them just right. That Tuesday morning, the light seemed more fragile somehow, as if the colors themselves were holding their breath. Maria Contreras, the church's elderly caretaker, noticed that Father Andrés seemed distracted during his morning preparations. She had known him since his arrival and could read the subtle signs of his moods, the way his fingers drummed against the altar when he was thinking, how his voice carried a different cadence when something troubled him. That morning, his movements were deliberate but restless, like a man preparing for a journey he wasn't sure he wanted to take. "Padre," she had whispered to him after the sparse congregation had filed out, their footsteps echoing against the stone. "You seem far away today." Father Andrés had smiled then, that gentle smile that had comforted so many in their darkest hours. "Just listening, Maria. Sometimes God speaks loudest in the silence before the storm." By mid-morning, the radio broadcasts began interrupting regular programming with urgent bulletins. The government of Salvador Allende was under siege. Military aircraft circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their engines drowning out the usual sounds of daily life. Children playing in the plaza, vendors calling out their wares, the gentle bleating of goats from the hillside farms. The last person to see Father Andrés was young Pablo Hernandez, a 12-year-old altar boy whose family lived in one of the tin-roofed houses that climbed the hillside like colorful building blocks. Pablo had come to the church around noon, hoping to find the priest and ask if evening services would be cancelled due to the strange happenings in the capital. He found the church empty, but the priest's bicycle was still chained to the iron fence outside, its blue paint chipped and faded from 3 years of faithful service through Santiago's unpredictable weather. On Father Andrés's desk in the small rectory behind the church, Pablo noticed an unfinished letter, the ink still wet enough to smear when a sudden gust of wind through the open window caught the paper. The letter was addressed to the priest's sister in Valparaiso, beginning with the words, "Querida Carmen, if something should happen to me," but the sentence remained incomplete, hanging in the air like an unfinished prayer. The afternoon brought soldiers to San Miguel. They moved through the streets with the precision of men following orders they didn't fully understand, their boots clicking against the cobblestones in a rhythm that felt foreign to this peaceful neighborhood. They asked questions. Had anyone seen unusual activity, suspicious gatherings, communist sympathizers? The questions themselves seemed to change the very air people breathed, making ordinary conversations feel dangerous. As evening fell and Father Andrés failed to appear for Vespers, Maria Contreras lit the church candles herself. The small flames flickered in the growing darkness, their light casting dancing shadows on the walls where generations had come to seek solace. She waited until midnight, her rosary beads clicking softly between her weathered fingers, before finally accepting that something had gone terribly wrong. The next morning, when concerned parishioners gathered at the church, they found Father Andrés's simple wooden cross hanging empty on its hook beside the altar. His personal belongings remained untouched in the rectory, his books of theology and poetry, his guitar with its carefully maintained strings, the small clay figurine of St. Francis that his mother had given him upon ordination. Everything suggested he had simply stepped away for a moment and would return any minute to resume his quiet ministry. But Father Andrés Morales never returned. In the chaos that followed Pinochet's coup, one missing priest became lost among thousands of disappeared souls. Official inquiries led nowhere. The local police, when they bothered to respond at all, suggested he had fled to Argentina, like so many others seeking refuge from the new regime's reach. Years passed, and the mystery of Father Andres became woven into the fabric of San Miguel's collective memory. Old-timers would point to the empty rectory and whisper stories to their grandchildren about the young priest who had vanished like morning mist. Some said he had been a communist sympathizer. Others insisted he was simply a man of God who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The truth, like so many truths from those dark days, seemed buried beneath layers of fear, silence, and time. If this story moves you to think about those who vanished without a trace, you might want to subscribe to hear more untold stories from this turbulent time in Chilean history. The Church of Santa Teresa continued to hold services, served by a succession of priests who came and went, but none quite filled the space that Father Andres had occupied in the hearts of his congregation. His empty bicycle remained chained to the fence for 3 years, a silent sentinel that spoke of absence more eloquently than any words. Eventually, Maria Contreras removed it, storing it in the church basement where it gathered dust alongside other forgotten relics of a time that felt both distant and immediate, depending on who was remembering. In the silence that followed his disappearance, questions multiplied like shadows at sunset. Had he been targeted for his work with the poor? Had someone accused him of political activities? Or had he simply been unlucky enough to witness something he shouldn't have seen on that chaotic September day when democracy died and fear took its place in the hearts of ordinary people? The answers would remain hidden for 40 years, buried as deeply as the pain that still lived in the eyes of those who had loved him. But sometimes in the mystery of time and memory, truth has a way of surfacing when it's least expected, carried forward by the most unlikely messengers. 40 years later, Santiago had transformed into a bustling modern city where glass towers reflected the same Andean peaks that had witnessed the chaos of 1973. The wounds of the dictatorship had not fully healed, but they had been covered by layers of progress, prosperity, and a collective desire to move forward. Yet in the quiet corners of the city, in the homes of the elderly and the archives of human rights organizations, memory persisted like a stubborn stain that refused to fade. In the spring of 2013, Carmen Morales sat in her small apartment in Valparaiso, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a life spent searching for answers that never came. At 78, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her eyes remained sharp with the particular intensity of someone who had never stopped looking for her missing brother. The walls of her living room were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and official documents, a shrine to persistence that had become her life's work. Every September 11th for 4 decades, Carmen had made the same pilgrimage to Santiago, visiting government offices, human rights organizations, and anyone who might have information about Father Andres. Her ritual had become as predictable as the seasonal blooming of the jacaranda trees that lined Valparaiso's steep streets. She would dress in her best black dress, the one she had bought for her brother's ordination, and carry a manila folder containing the same documents she had been showing officials since 1974. The folder had grown thicker over the years, not with answers, but with bureaucratic responses, form letters expressing regret but no information, photocopied reports that mentioned her brother's case in passing, witness statements that led nowhere. Each document was carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, organized chronologically, a meticulous record of official indifference that had become its own form of testimony. Carmen's apartment overlooked the Pacific Ocean, and on clear days she could see container ships moving slowly across the horizon, like distant promises of connection to the wider world. But her world had contracted to the size of her brother's memory, and every decision she made was filtered through the question of whether it might somehow lead to information about his fate. She had never married, never had children, never allowed herself to fully inhabit a future that didn't include answers about the past. Her neighbors in the hillside neighborhood of Cerro Bella Vista knew her as the quiet woman who received mail from human rights organizations across Latin America. They would see her walking to the post office each Tuesday, her gray hair pulled back in the same simple bun she had worn since the 1970s, carrying letters addressed to archives in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Her hope was methodical and international. Perhaps someone, somewhere, had seen a young Chilean priest seeking refuge, had heard a name mentioned in passing, had filed a report that might contain the fragment of truth she needed. In her kitchen, Carmen kept a notebook where she recorded every lead, every conversation, every dead end. The pages were filled with her careful handwriting, each entry dated and cross-referenced with others. March 15, 1987. Spoke with Father Rodriguez at Cathedral. Says no records of AA transfer requests. June 3, 1994. Letter from Vicaria de la Solidaridad. No new information. October 22, 2001. Met woman at memorial service who remembers AA blessing her daughter's wedding, September 1973. Confirms he was planning to stay in Santiago. The notebook had become a form of prayer for Carmen, a way of keeping her brother alive through the accumulation of details about his absence. She had memorized every entry, could recite dates and conversations with the precision of a scholar studying sacred texts. But scholarship requires sources, and the sources of her brother's fate remained locked away in places she couldn't access, protected by the silence that had settled over Chile like a heavy blanket after the coup. On quiet evenings, Carmen would sit by her window and read aloud from the unfinished letter she had retrieved from her brother's rectory in those chaotic days after his disappearance. The letter, now yellowed and fragile, remained exactly as Pablo Hernandez had found it. Querida Carmen, if something should happen to me. The incomplete sentence had become a conversation she continued in her mind, imagining what he might have wanted to tell her, what warning or comfort he had been trying to provide. She had researched her brother's final days with the dedication of a detective, interviewing parishioners who remembered him, tracking down altar boys who had grown into middle-aged men with children of their own. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle of who Father Andres had been in those final weeks, but none provided the crucial information about where he had gone or why he had never returned. The picture that emerged from these interviews was of a young priest who had been growing increasingly concerned about the political situation in Chile. Several parishioners remembered him speaking more frequently about social justice in his homilies, about the responsibility of the faithful to protect the vulnerable. Maria Contreras, now in her 90s and living with her daughter in Santiago, could still recall specific phrases from his final sermons. God calls us to be light in dark places, and sometimes love requires courage we didn't know we possessed. But concern about social justice was not uncommon among Chilean priests in 1973, and even specific quotes couldn't explain why Father Andres had vanished while others had remained safe. Carmen had learned to live with the possibility that her brother's disappearance might have been random. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong person, asking the wrong questions. The randomness was almost harder to bear than the alternative. At least, targeted persecution suggested that his life had mattered enough to someone to warrant elimination. As the 40th anniversary of the coup approached, Carmen found herself fighting a familiar mixture of hope and dread. Milestone anniversaries often brought renewed attention to disappeared persons cases, sometimes leading to new revelations or the release of previously classified documents. But they also brought painful reminders of how much time had passed, how many opportunities for truth had already been lost. In her prayers each night, Carmen asked not for her brother's return. She had long since accepted that he was gone, but for the simple grace of knowing what had happened to him. She wanted to know whether he had suffered, whether he had been afraid, whether he had thought of her in his final moments. These were the questions that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom while the fog rolled in from the Pacific and settled over Valparaiso like a grey benediction. The truth she sought was hidden somewhere in the vast archives of Chile's recent past, waiting to be discovered by someone with access to the right documents, the right connections, the right moment of courage or coincidence. What Carmen couldn't know was that the answer was already beginning its long journey toward the light, carried forward by a different kind of memory in the hands of someone she had never met. Captain Ricardo Fuentes had carried the weight of September 11, 1973, in his bones for 40 years. Now 68 and long retired from military service, he spent his days in his small house in the Santiago suburb of Ñuñoa, tending to a garden that had become his sanctuary from memories that refused to fade. His hands, once steady enough to clean a rifle in complete darkness, now trembled slightly as he pruned his roses and watered the vegetables he grew with the obsessive care of a man trying to nurture life after having taken it. The house was modest, almost Spartan, reflecting the discipline that had shaped his adult life. But hidden in a cedar chest in his bedroom closet, wrapped in oiled cloth like a sacred relic, was a leather-bound journal that contained the most honest record of those early days of the Pinochet regime that existed outside of official files. For 40 years, Ricardo had kept the journal secret, unsure whether its contents would condemn him or exonerate him, uncertain whether the truth it contained was worth the price it might exact from those still living. Ricardo had been 28 in 1973, a career military officer who had believed in duty, order, and the necessity of protecting Chile from what his superiors described as communist infiltration. He had joined the army not from political conviction, but from a family tradition that stretched back 3 generations. His grandfather had fought in the War of the Pacific. His father had served in the Chilean military mission to Spain during World War II, and Ricardo had always assumed he would follow the same path of honorable service to country. But nothing in his family's military tradition had prepared him for the moral complexities he encountered in the weeks following the coup. The journal he had started as a simple record of his duties had gradually transformed into something more personal and more dangerous, a detailed account of operations that were never supposed to be documented, decisions that were never supposed to be questioned, and consequences that were never supposed to be acknowledged. The journal's early entries were written in the clipped, formal language of military reports. 0600 hours proceeded to designated sector for security sweep. 0730 hours detained 3 suspects for questioning. 1100 hours transported suspects to processing center. But as the days accumulated and the nature of the security operations became clear, Ricardo's writing had evolved into something more reflective and increasingly troubled. By October 1973, the entries had begun to include observations that would have been considered insubordinate at best, treasonous at worst. The chaplain says we are protecting Christian civilization, but today I watched a man weep as we searched his home for books. His crime was teaching his children to read. And later, Colonel Martinez says the enemies of the state can be identified by their associations. But how do we determine guilt by friendship? How do we measure subversion in the weight of a shared meal or the lending of a book? The entry for September 23, 1973 was longer than most, and written in handwriting that showed signs of agitation, the normally neat letters pressed deep into the paper as if the writer had been trying to carve the words into stone. Today we arrested a priest in San Miguel, Father Andrés Morales, age 34, accused of harboring communist sympathizers and conducting seditious meetings in his church. The accusation came from an informant whose reliability is questionable, a man with personal grievances against the church over a property dispute. But orders are orders, and we proceeded with the detention. The priest was calm when we arrived at his church, almost as if he had been expecting us. He asked only that we allow him to lock the church properly and leave a note for his housekeeper. Strange request from a man about to be interrogated for crimes against the state, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested he understood the gravity of his situation better than we did. During transport, Father Morales spoke quietly about his congregation, asking if arrangements could be made for another priest to conduct Sunday services. His concern was not for himself, but for the spiritual welfare of his parishioners. Sergeant Lopez commented later that the priest seemed more like a man going to minister to the sick than one facing charges of subversion. The interrogation was conducted by Lieutenant Vasquez and Captain Hernandez. I was present as a witness, but not as a participant. The priest maintained his innocence of all political charges, but acknowledged that he had provided food and shelter to families displaced by the economic turmoil. When asked if he had known the political affiliations of those he helped, he responded that hunger has no politics, that Christ called his followers to feed the poor without conducting ideological examinations first. Lieutenant Vasquez became increasingly agitated by the priest's responses, which he interpreted as defiance, rather than theological conviction. The interrogation continued for 6 hours with no confession obtained. Father Morales requested permission to pray and was granted 15 minutes. He spent the time not in petition for his own welfare, but in prayer for the souls of his interrogators, asking God to forgive us for whatever we felt compelled to do in service to our understanding of duty. At 2300 hours, I was ordered to transport the prisoner to a holding facility outside the city. The facility was not on any official map I had seen, and the guards who received Father Morales were not regular army personnel. When I asked about processing procedures and documentation, I was told that some operations required special handling, that certain cases fell outside normal protocols. I never saw Father Andres Morales again. When I inquired about his case 3 days later, I was told that no such prisoner had been processed through our unit, that no arrest had been made at the church in San Miguel, that no record existed of the operation I had participated in with my own hands and witnessed with my own eyes. This is the reality of our new order. Truth becomes whatever serves the state, and memory becomes a form of treason. I write these words knowing that possessing them could cost me my career, my freedom, perhaps my life. But I also know that forgetting them would cost me something more valuable, the possibility of redemption for what we have done in the name of protecting our country. Ricardo had continued writing in the journal throughout his military service, documenting similar cases, recording the gradual erosion of his faith in the mission he had sworn to serve. By the time he retired in 1995, the journal contained over 300 pages of testimonies that read like confessions from a man trying to preserve his sanity by preserving the truth. For 20 years after retirement, Ricardo had lived with the journal like a man living with an unexploded bomb. He knew that its contents could implicate dozens of officers, some now dead, others holding positions of power in post-Pinochet Chile. He also knew that the families mentioned in its pages, families like the Morales family, deserved to know what had happened to their loved ones. As he aged and his health began to decline, Ricardo found himself thinking more frequently about legacy, about the weight of secrets carried too long, about the possibility that death might rob the truth of its final opportunity to surface. The garden that had become his refuge was also becoming his confession booth, the place where he spoke aloud to his roses and vegetables about things he had never been able to say to another human being. In the spring of 2013, when the jacaranda trees bloomed with their usual purple profusion, and the 40th anniversary of the coup-dominated newspaper headlines, Ricardo Fuentes made a decision that would finally allow him to sleep peacefully for the first time in 4 decades. The truth had been patient long enough. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent 15 years working in the archives of Chile's Museum of Memory and Human Rights, a career dedicated to the meticulous cataloging of a nation's darkest chapter. At 39, she possessed the particular temperament required for such work, infinite patience, emotional resilience, and the ability to find meaning in fragments. Her small office on the museum's 3rd floor was lined with filing cabinets containing thousands of testimonies, photographs, and documents that families had donated in hopes that their stories might contribute to the historical record. Eleanor had come to the work not through academic interest but through personal necessity. Her own father had been detained briefly in 1974, released after 2 weeks, with instructions never to speak of his experience. He had followed those instructions until his death in 2003, carrying his silence to the grave, like a family heirloom he couldn't bear to pass down. Eleanor's work at the museum was her way of breaking that silence, of ensuring that other families didn't inherit the same burden of unanswered questions. The museum's archive was organized according to a complex system that Elena had helped design, chronological, geographical, and thematic categories that allowed researchers to trace patterns across the 17 years of military rule. But despite the systematic approach, discoveries often came through chance, through the intersection of unrelated donations, through the kind of serendipity that Elena had learned to recognize as the archive's way of revealing truths that had been waiting decades to surface. On a grey Tuesday morning in August 2013, Elena was processing a recent donation from the estate of Ricardo Fuentes, a retired army captain who had died the previous month. His niece had brought 3 boxes of personal effects to the museum, uncertain about their historical value, but unwilling to destroy them without professional evaluation. Most of the donation consisted of routine military documents, medals, and photographs that would be added to the museum's collection of military memorabilia from the period. But buried beneath layers of official correspondence and commendation letters, Elena discovered the leather-bound journal wrapped in oiled cloth. The weight of it in her hands suggested something significant. Personal journals from military personnel were extremely rare in the museum's collection, as most had been destroyed or hidden by their authors. As she carefully unwrapped the journal, Elena felt the familiar quickening of pulse that accompanied important discoveries. The journal's cover was worn smooth by decades of handling, the leather softened to the texture of old skin. Inside, the pages were filled with handwriting that varied from neat military script to agitated scrawls, reflecting the emotional state of the writer across 25 years of entries. Elena recognized immediately that this was not a routine military diary, but something far more sensitive, a record of operations that had never been meant for historical scrutiny. As Elena read through the entries, she understood why Ricardo Fuentes had kept the journal hidden for so long. The level of detail about detention operations, interrogation procedures, and disposal of prisoners was unprecedented in the museum's collection. But what struck her most powerfully was the moral evolution documented in the pages, the transformation of a dutiful soldier into a man haunted by his participation in state terror. The entry dated September 23, 1973, stopped Elena's breath completely. She read it twice, then a third time before reaching for her computer to search the museum's database. Father Andrés Morales appeared in their records as case number 1973-09-1247, one of approximately 1,200 people who had disappeared during the first month of the military regime. His file was thin, a missing person report filed by his sister, a few witness statements from parishioners, and a note that inquiries had yielded no information about his fate. Elena had worked with enough disappearance cases to recognize the significance of Ricardo Fuentes' testimony. This was direct evidence of detention and transport, recorded by a participant in real time. It provided details that could corroborate other testimonies, identify previously unknown detention facilities, and most importantly, offer a family the truth about their loved one's final days. But Elena also understood the complexities that such a discovery would unleash. The journal implicated dozens of military personnel, some still alive, in operations that constituted crimes against humanity. Its publication could reopen legal proceedings, destroy reputations, and traumatize families who had built their lives on silence about the past. The truth was rarely simple, and Elena had learned that her role as an archivist required her to be both guardian and gatekeeper of historical memory. She spent the afternoon reading through the entire journal, taking careful notes and cross-referencing names and dates with the museum's database. By evening, she had identified 43 previously unknown cases mentioned in Ricardo Fuentes' writings, including detailed descriptions of detention centers, interrogation techniques, and the chain of command for extrajudicial operations. The journal was a historian's treasure and a prosecutor's roadmap, a document that could reshape understanding of the coup's immediate aftermath. But Elena's thoughts kept returning to the case of Father Andrés Morales, perhaps because the writing about his arrest was so detailed, so reflective, so clearly the product of a conscience struggling with moral complicity. Ricardo Fuentes had been haunted by this particular case in ways that came through clearly in his prose. The priest had affected him, challenged him, forced him to confront the human cost of the orders he was following. That evening, Elena remained in her office long after the museum had closed, reading and rereading the entry about Father Morales. The building was quiet except for the hum of climate control systems, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity required to preserve historical documents. In the silence, Elena felt the weight of responsibility that came with possessing information that could change lives, could bring closure to some families, while opening wounds for others. She thought about Carmen Morales, whose name appeared regularly in the museum's visitor logs. For 15 years, Elena had watched Carmen arrive every September 11th, asking the same questions, hoping for the same answers that never came. Elena had developed a professional relationship with Carmen, characterized by mutual respect and shared frustration at the limits of available evidence. Now Elena possessed the evidence Carmen had been seeking for 40 years, but she also knew that the truth came with complexities that might be as painful as the absence of answers. The journal revealed that Father Andres had been alive at least 12 days after his arrest, that he had been transferred to a secret detention facility, that his interrogation had yielded no evidence of subversive activity. But it also made clear that prisoners who entered such facilities rarely emerged, that the special handling mentioned in Ricardo Fuentes' account was likely a euphemism for execution. The truth Elena had discovered was simultaneously an answer and a confirmation of worst fears. As midnight approached, Elena made photocopies of the relevant pages and secured the original journal in the museum's climate-controlled vault. She would need to consult with the museum's director, with lawyers familiar with human rights law, with psychologists who specialized in helping families process traumatic revelations. The process of truth-telling required careful consideration of timing, context, and support systems. But she also knew that some truths could not wait for perfect circumstances. Carmen Morales was 78 years old and had spent 40 years searching for information about her brother. The journal in Elena's custody represented the closest thing to closure that Carmen was ever likely to receive. The archivist's duty to historical accuracy demanded that the truth be shared, but Elena's human compassion demanded that it be shared with care. The next morning, Elena would begin the delicate process of contacting Carmen Morales, of arranging a meeting that would finally answer questions that had shaped an entire life. The truth had been waiting 40 years to surface. It could wait one more day for Elena to find the right words to deliver it with the dignity and respect that both Carmen and her brother deserved. The phone call came on a Thursday morning in September, when the first hints of spring were beginning to warm the streets of Valparaiso, and Carmen Morales was preparing for her annual pilgrimage to Santiago. She had been sitting at her kitchen table, reviewing the contents of her manila folder for the 40th time, when the unfamiliar number appeared on her old rotary phone. The voice on the other end was professional but gentle, introducing itself as Dr. Elena Vasquez from the Museum of Memory and Human Rights. "Senora Morales," Elena said carefully, "I'm calling about your brother, Father Andres. We may have found some information that could be relevant to your search." Carmen's hand tightened on the receiver, her heart beginning the familiar rhythm of hope and dread that had accompanied every potential lead over the decades. She had received similar calls before: well-meaning researchers, journalists following cold trails, government officials with form letters disguised as personal attention. Each had led nowhere, leaving her with the particular exhaustion that comes from hope repeatedly deferred. "What kind of information?" Carmen asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person," Elena replied. "Could you come to Santiago? I know it's a significant journey from Valparaiso, but I believe what I have to show you is worth the trip." Something in Elena's tone suggested that this call was different from the others. There was a weight to her words, a careful formality that spoke of someone carrying important news. Carmen agreed to meet the following Tuesday, giving herself time to prepare emotionally for whatever revelation awaited her. The days between the phone call and the meeting stretched like an eternity. Carmen found herself unable to concentrate on her usual routines: the morning walk to the market, the afternoon letters to human rights organizations, the evening prayers that had structured her life for 4 decades. Instead, she sat by her window overlooking the Pacific, watching the ships move slowly across the horizon, and wondering whether she was finally about to learn what had happened to her brother. On Tuesday morning, Carmen dressed with particular care in her best black dress and took the early bus to Santiago. The 2-hour journey through the coastal hills gave her time to think about what she hoped to hear and what she feared to learn. After 40 years of searching, the possibility of answers felt almost as frightening as the certainty of continued ignorance. At least ignorance allowed for the persistence of hope. Knowledge might require the acceptance of truths too painful to bear. The Museum of Memory and Human Rights stood in the Quinta Normal district of Santiago, a modern building designed to honor the victims of the dictatorship while educating future generations about the importance of democratic values. Carmen had visited the museum several times over the years, walking through its galleries with the particular reverence of someone whose personal loss was represented in its collections. But this visit felt different. She was no longer just a visitor, but potentially a participant in the historical record the museum preserved. Eleanor met Carmen in the museum's lobby, recognizing her immediately from previous encounters during her annual September visits. Eleanor had prepared carefully for this meeting, consulting with the museum's psychologists about how to present traumatic information with appropriate sensitivity. She guided Carmen to a private conference room on the 3rd floor, a space designed specifically for families receiving difficult news about their loved ones. "Señora Morales," Elena began, settling into a chair across from Carmen, "what I'm about to share with you comes from a recently donated journal written by a military officer who participated in operations during the early days of the coup. The officer, Captain Ricardo Fuentes, documented his experiences in detail, including his involvement in your brother's arrest." Carmen's breath caught. After 40 years of official denials, bureaucratic stonewalling, and carefully worded expressions of regret, someone was finally speaking to her about her brother's arrest as an established fact rather than an unsubstantiated allegation. Eleanor placed a folder on the table between them. "Before I show you this, I want you to understand that the information is detailed and specific. It will answer some questions you've been asking for 40 years, but it may also confirm fears you've been carrying just as long. Are you prepared for that?" Carmen nodded, her voice momentarily failing her. She had waited too long and sacrificed too much to turn away now, regardless of what truths awaited her. Elena opened the folder and removed photocopies of the relevant pages from Ricardo Fuentes' journal. She had prepared a summary in her own words, designed to convey the essential information without subjecting Carmen to the raw language of the military report. But Carmen asked to see the original text, explaining that she needed to know exactly what had happened in the words of someone who had been there. As Carmen read Ricardo Fuentes' account of September 23, 1973, tears began to flow down her cheeks. Not tears of grief, but tears of relief. For the first time in 40 years, she was reading an eyewitness account of her brother's final days, written by someone who had observed his dignity, his faith, his concern for others, even in the face of imprisonment and interrogation. "He prayed for his interrogators," Carmen whispered, her finger tracing the relevant passage in the journal. "Even then, he was ministering to others." Eleanor remained silent, allowing Carmen time to process the information at her own pace. The psychologists had advised her that families receiving such news needed space to absorb the details, to fit new information into the narrative they had constructed about their loved one's fate. After several minutes, Carmen looked up from the documents. "What happened to him after this? Does the journal say anything about where he was taken? What happened at this detention facility?" Eleanor had dreaded this question, knowing that the answer would transform relief into grief. Captain Fuentes was not involved in subsequent operations, but based on our research into the facility he mentions and cross-referencing with other testimonies from that period, we believe that prisoners taken there that they did not survive. The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of finality that Carmen had both anticipated and resisted for 4 decades. She closed her eyes, feeling 40 years of uncertainty crystallize into certainty, 40 years of hope transform into acceptance. "At least he wasn't alone," Carmen said finally. "At least someone witnessed his faith, recorded his dignity. At least someone remembered." Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand gently over Carmen's. "Señora Morales, I want you to know that Captain Fuentes was clearly affected by his encounter with your brother. His writing about Father Andrés is different from his accounts of other operations, more personal, more reflective. Your brother made an impression on him that lasted for the rest of his life." Carmen nodded, understanding that this was perhaps the most important revelation of all. Her brother had not died anonymously, had not vanished without touching another human being's conscience. Even in his final days, Father Andrés had continued to minister, to challenge, to plant seeds of moral reflection that had grown in the journal of a conflicted soldier. "I'd like to visit the place where he was taken," Carmen said, her voice gaining strength as she processed the revelation. Is it possible to determine the location of this detention facility? Elena had anticipated this request and had spent considerable time researching the site mentioned in Ricardo Fuentes' journal. The facility was located in the hills outside Melipilla, about an hour from Santiago. It was one of several unofficial detention centers that operated during the first months of the coup. The buildings were demolished in 1980, but the site has been identified, and there's now a small memorial there. Carmen absorbed this information with the careful attention she had given to every detail about her brother's case over the decades. The knowledge that a place existed where she could go to feel closer to Andres, where she could finally say goodbye properly, seemed to provide a sense of completion that she hadn't expected. "There's something else," Elena continued, pulling another document from her folder. "Captain Fuentes mentions in his journal that your brother asked to leave a note for his housekeeper before he was taken. We found that note among the papers donated by the San Miguel parish when they cleaned out their archives in 2010. They had kept it all these years, not knowing its significance." With trembling hands, Carmen accepted the photocopy of a handwritten note in her brother's familiar script. "Maria, I have been called away unexpectedly. Please ensure that the church remains open for those who need sanctuary. The poor box contains enough for 3 weeks of emergency assistance. Tell the children their priest loves them and will remember them in his prayers. God's peace be with you all. Father Andres." Reading her brother's final written words, Carmen understood that even facing arrest, Andres had remained focused on the welfare of his congregation. The note contained no self-pity, no political statements, no appeals for help, only practical instructions and expressions of love for the community he served. "He knew," Carmen said quietly. "Somehow he knew he wouldn't be coming back, but he used his last free moments to take care of others." Elena nodded, recognizing in Carmen's reaction the particular mixture of pride and sorrow that characterized families who discovered that their loved ones had faced death with dignity. The note revealed Father Andres not as a victim, but as a man who had maintained his essential character even under extreme duress. The meeting continued for another hour, with Elena providing additional context about the political situation in 1973, the fate of other clergy who had been targeted during the coup, and the broader pattern of repression that had swept through Chilean society. But the core revelation had been delivered. Carmen now knew what had happened to her brother, where he had been taken, and how he had conducted himself in his final days. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Elena made one final offer. "Senora Morales, if you'd like, I can arrange for you to meet with some of the parishioners from San Miguel who are still alive. Many of them have wondered about your brother's fate as well, and they might appreciate the opportunity to share their memories with you." Carmen accepted gratefully, understanding that these connections might help her process the information she had received and find ways to honor her brother's memory that went beyond her solitary vigil in Valparaiso. For the first time in 40 years, she would not be searching alone. The bus ride back to Valparaiso that evening was unlike any journey Carmen had taken in 4 decades. Instead of returning with empty hands and unanswered questions, she carried with her a folder containing the truth she had sought for so long. The truth was painful. Confirmation that her brother had died in detention, probably within days of his arrest, but it was also liberating. The uncertainty that had dominated her life was finally over. As the bus wound through the coastal hills and the lights of Valparaiso came into view, Carmen began to think about what came next. She would need to plan a proper memorial service for Andres, to notify the few remaining family members scattered across Chile and Argentina, to visit the site where he had been held. But for the first time since 1973, these were tasks of commemoration rather than investigation, acts of honoring rather than searching. Most importantly, Carmen finally understood that her 40-year vigil had not been in vain. Her persistence, her refusal to accept official denials, her annual pilgrimages to Santiago had all contributed to the preservation of her brother's memory. The truth had emerged not because of government transparency or official acknowledgement, but because someone had found the courage to document what he had witnessed, and because institutions like the Museum of Memory had created spaces where such testimonies could be preserved and shared. The next morning, Carmen woke in her apartment overlooking the Pacific and experienced something she had not felt in 4 decades: peace. She knew what had happened to her brother. She knew that he had died as he had lived, with faith, dignity, and concern for others. The questions that had shaped her life for 40 years had finally been answered, and she could begin the process of transforming her grief into something more constructive than endless searching. She opened her notebook, the one where she had recorded every lead, every dead end, every conversation about her brother's disappearance, and wrote her final entry. September 18th, 2013. Truth found. Andrés died as he lived, faithful to the end. My search is over. My remembrance begins. Word of the discovery spread quietly through the networks of families who had lost loved ones during the dictatorship, carried by the particular mixture of sorrow and relief that accompanied long-delayed revelations. Within days of Carmen's meeting at the Museum of Memory, Elena Vasquez received calls from former parishioners of San Miguel who had learned about Father Andrés's fate through conversations with other church members and human rights activists. The first to contact the museum was Pablo Hernández, now 52, and working as a mechanic in Santiago's Maipú district. Pablo had been the 12-year-old altar boy who discovered the priest's unfinished letter on that chaotic September day in 1973. For 4 decades he had carried the memory of finding Father Andrés's bicycle still chained to the church fence, of reading those interrupted words, "Querida Carmen, if something should happen to me." I never forgot him, Pablo told Elena during their phone conversation. He taught me that serving God meant serving people, especially people who had nothing. I named my son Andrés in his memory, even though I never knew for certain what had happened to the priest. Pablo's voice carried the particular weight of someone who had witnessed the moment when ordinary life transformed into something irrevocably different. He had been old enough to understand that Father Andrés's disappearance meant something terrible had occurred, but young enough that the event had shaped his understanding of how quickly safety could vanish, how suddenly beloved figures could be erased from daily life. Elena arranged for Pablo to meet with Carmen Morales the following week, understanding that both might benefit from sharing their memories of Father Andrés. The meeting took place in the small garden behind the Museum of Memory, a space designed for quiet reflection, where families often came to process difficult emotions in a setting that encouraged contemplation rather than analysis. When Pablo saw Carmen, he recognized in her face a resemblance to the priest he remembered, the same dark eyes, the same gentle expression that had made Father Andrés so beloved by his young parishioners. Carmen, for her part, saw in Pablo's weathered features the boy her brother had mentioned in his letters, the child who had shown such devotion to his altar server duties that Andrés had written about considering him for seminary training. "He spoke about you often in his letters to me," Carmen told Pablo as they sat on a wooden bench surrounded by native Chilean plants. "He said you had the kind of faith that asked good questions, that you weren't satisfied with simple answers about complex problems." Pablo smiled, remembering the long conversations he had shared with Father Andrés after weekday masses, when the church was empty except for the 2 of them and the votive candles flickering in the side chapels. The priest had treated him as an intellectual equal despite their age difference, engaging seriously with his questions about suffering, justice, and God's apparent silence in the face of human cruelty. "He never talked down to any of us," Pablo said. "Even when we asked him about politics, about why there was so much anger in the grown-up world, he gave us honest answers. He said that following Christ sometimes meant making choices that powerful people didn't like, but that love required courage, even when courage was dangerous." As they talked, other former parishioners began to arrive at the museum, drawn by word-of-mouth networks that had developed over 4 decades of shared loss and mutual support. Maria Contreras, now 93, and accompanied by her daughter, came with a small wooden box containing items she had saved from Father Andrés's rectory: his reading glasses, a bookmark made by one of the children in his catechism class, a photograph of his ordination that had hung on the wall beside his desk. Each visitor brought memories that added depth to the portrait of Father Andrés that emerged during that afternoon in the museum garden. Elena listened with the trained attention of an oral historian, recognizing that she was witnessing the creation of collective memory, the process by which individual recollections combine to form a more complete understanding of a person's impact on his community. Elena Guerra, a woman in her 60s who had been a young mother in San Miguel during Father Andrés' tenure, remembered how the priest had helped her family when her husband was briefly detained in October 1973. "He didn't ask questions about politics," she recalled. "He just showed up at our door with groceries and stayed with my children while I went to the police stations looking for information. When my husband was released, Father Andrés was there to help him process the trauma, to find his faith again after what he had experienced." The stories that emerged painted a picture of a priest who had understood his ministry in explicitly social terms, who had seen no separation between spiritual and material welfare. Several parishioners remembered his Sunday homilies during those final weeks, sermons that had grown increasingly bold in their references to social justice and the responsibility of Christians to protect the vulnerable. "He preached about the Good Samaritan a lot during those last months," remembered Carlos Moreno, who had been a teenager in 1973. "But he always emphasized that the important part of the story wasn't the mercy shown to the wounded man, but the courage required to stop and help when others had passed by. He said that love without courage was just sentiment, but love with courage could change the world." What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments below, because stories like this remind us that ordinary people faced impossible choices during those dark years in Chilean history. As the afternoon progressed, the gathering in the museum garden began to resemble a memorial service, with each participant sharing not only memories of Father Andrés, but also reflections on how his brief presence in their lives had influenced their subsequent choices. Several mentioned that they had become involved in human rights work after the return of democracy, motivated by lessons learned from their young priest about the necessity of standing with the marginalized. Pablo Hernandez spoke about his decision to become involved with prison ministry, visiting detained political prisoners during the 1980s, despite the personal risks involved. "Father Andrés taught me that faith wasn't something you practiced in church on Sundays," he explained. "It was something you lived every day, especially when living it was difficult or dangerous." Elena Vasquez recorded many of these conversations, understanding that they represented valuable additions to the historical record preserved by the Museum of Memory. But she also recognized that the afternoon was serving a function beyond historical documentation. It was providing healing for people who had carried their memories of Father Andrés in isolation for 40 years, never knowing if others shared their assessment of his character and significance. Carmen Morales listened to each testimony with the particular attention of someone hearing new stories about a beloved family member. The priest described by his former parishioners was recognizably her brother, the same man who had written her long letters about his theological studies, who had spent his seminary vacations working with poor families in Valparaiso, who had always been drawn to people and situations that others might find challenging or unpromising. But the stories also revealed aspects of her brother's personality that she had never known, dimensions of his character that had emerged only in his pastoral role. The Andrés described by his parishioners was more politically engaged than the brother she remembered, more willing to take risks, more explicitly committed to social transformation as a component of Christian witness. "I think the work changed him," Carmen said as the afternoon drew to a close. In his letters, he wrote about learning as much from his parishioners as he taught them. He said that serving the poor was teaching him things about God that seminary had never addressed. Maria Contreras, who had known Father Andrés better than anyone during his final months, nodded in agreement. "He was becoming the priest he was meant to be," she said. "You could see it in how he celebrated Mass, how he prepared his homilies, how he responded when people came to him with problems. He was finding his voice, learning to speak truth to power. That's probably why they took him." The gathering concluded with a spontaneous prayer led by Pablo Hernandez, who had retained enough of his altar server training to guide the group through a modified version of the prayers for the dead that Father Andrés had taught him 40 years earlier. But the prayer was not entirely mournful. It contained elements of thanksgiving for the priest's life and witness, gratitude for the discovery of truth about his fate, and commitment to honor his memory through continued service to others. As the participants prepared to leave the museum, Elena made arrangements for copies of Ricardo Fuentes' journal entries to be made available to anyone who wanted them, understanding that the testimony would provide closure not only for Carmen, but for the entire community that had lost their priest. She also provided information about the memorial site in Melipilla, knowing that several of the former parishioners would want to visit the place where Father Andres had spent his final days. The afternoon had demonstrated something that Elena had observed repeatedly in her work with families of the disappeared. Truth, even painful truth, was almost always preferable to uncertainty. The former parishioners left the museum with confirmed knowledge that their priest had died in detention, but they also left with renewed appreciation for the impact he had made during his brief ministry, and strengthened connections to others who shared their memories. For Carmen, the meeting provided something even more valuable than closure. It offered her a vision of how her brother's legacy could be preserved and honored by people who had known him not as family, but as pastor, teacher, and friend. The search that had consumed 40 years of her life was over, but the work of remembrance was just beginning. 3 weeks after her meeting at the Museum of Memory, Carmen Morales made a journey she had avoided for 40 years, a return to the parish of San Miguel, where her brother had served his final assignment. She traveled by bus from Valparaiso to Santiago, then took 2 smaller buses through neighborhoods that had been transformed by decades of urban growth, but still retained the essential character she remembered from her occasional visits during Andres's brief tenure as parish priest. The Church of Santa Teresa stood unchanged at the center of the old neighborhood, its whitewashed walls and red tile roof providing continuity in a district where modern apartment buildings now rose between the original single-story houses. Carmen approached the building slowly, her emotions cycling between anticipation and trepidation as she prepared to enter the space where her brother had celebrated his final masses. Pablo Hernandez had arranged to meet her at the church, bringing with him several other former parishioners who wanted to participate in an informal memorial for Father Andres. Elena Vasquez had also come from the museum, carrying copies of the relevant documents and a small recording device to capture any additional memories that might emerge during the visit. The current parish priest, Father Miguel Santander, had prepared carefully for this gathering. He had served at Santa Teresa for 12 years and had heard stories about his predecessor from older parishioners, but he had never known the full circumstances of Father Andres's disappearance. The discovery of Ricardo Fuentes' journal had provided him with details that helped explain certain aspects of parish folklore, why older parishioners sometimes spoke in hushed tones about the priest who was taken, why September always brought a particular solemnity to the church calendar. Inside the church, very little had changed since 1973. The same wooden pews bore the marks of generations of worshippers. The same stained glass windows cast colored light across the stone floor. The same simple altar hosted the tabernacle where the consecrated host was preserved between services. Carmen stood for several minutes in the center aisle, trying to imagine her brother moving through this space, preparing for services, greeting parishioners, delivering the homilies that former congregants remembered with such clarity. He stood right there for his final mass, Maria Contreras said, pointing to the pulpit. Despite her advanced age, she had insisted on attending this gathering, understanding that it might be her last opportunity to share her memories of the priest she had served so devotedly. September 9th, 1973. He preached about hope in dark times, about trusting that God's love was stronger than human hatred. Carmen approached the pulpit and placed her hand on the wooden rail where her brother had rested his hands while delivering sermons. The physical connection to the place where Andres had spent his final days provided a sense of presence that had been missing from her 40-year search. Here, finally, she could feel close to the brother she had lost, could imagine his voice echoing in the space where his words had once provided comfort and challenge to his congregation. Father Santander led the group to the small rectory behind the church, where Father Andres had lived during his assignment to San Miguel. The building had been renovated several times over the decades, but the basic layout remained the same. A simple kitchen, a modest living room with shelves for books, a small bedroom, and an office where the parish priest conducted administrative work and prepared his homilies. This was where he wrote his letters, Carmen said, standing in the office and remembering the regular correspondence she had received from her brother during his time in Santiago. He always wrote on Sunday afternoons after the evening service. He said it helped him process the week, to think about what he had learned from his parishioners. Pablo Hernandez showed Carmen the small garden behind the rectory, where Father Andres had grown vegetables that he distributed to families experiencing economic hardship. The garden was still maintained by the current parish priest, continuing a tradition that stretched back to Father Andres's brief tenure and reflected his understanding that ministry included attention to material as well as spiritual needs. He used to say that God was present in every tomato, every potato, every meal that hungry people shared, Pablo remembered. He made theology practical, made faith something you could touch and taste and give away. As the group moved through the spaces where Father Andres had lived and worked, additional memories emerged. Carmen learned that her brother had established a small lending library in the parish hall, collecting books from parishioners and organizing them by subject, so that children and adults could borrow materials for education and entertainment. Several of the books remained in the parish collection, their margins filled with notes in Father Andres's careful handwriting. Elena Vasquez documented these discoveries, understanding that they revealed aspects of Father Andres's ministry that had not been captured in official records or even in family correspondence. The priest who emerged from these material traces was someone who had thought systematically about community development, who had understood his role as extending far beyond the celebration of Mass and administration of sacraments. In the church basement, Father Santander showed the group a storage room where items from Father Andres's tenure had been preserved by successive parish priests. Among the boxes of old vestments and church records, Carmen discovered personal items that had somehow been overlooked during the chaos following her brother's disappearance. His guitar, several books of poetry, a small wooden crucifix that their mother had given him upon ordination. Holding the guitar, Carmen remembered evenings during their childhood when Andres had played folk songs and hymns, experimenting with arrangements that combined traditional melodies with contemporary rhythms. Several parishioners mentioned that he had incorporated music into his masses in ways that were innovative for the early 1970s, encouraging congregational singing and using the guitar to accompany hymns in Spanish rather than Latin. He said that God spoke all languages, but that people prayed most honestly in their mother tongue, recalled Elena Guerra. He wanted the Mass to feel like something that belonged to us, not something that was performed for us by someone speaking ancient words we couldn't understand. As afternoon turned to evening, the group gathered in the main church for an informal memorial service. Father Santander had prepared a simple liturgy that incorporated elements from the Mass, as it would have been celebrated in 1973, using some of the same prayers and hymns that Father Andres would have used during his final weeks at Santa Teresa. Carmen read aloud from the unfinished letter that her brother had been writing on the day of his arrest. Querida Carmen, if something should happen to me, know that I have found my calling here among people who understand that faith requires action, that love demands justice, that hope persists even in the darkest times. She had completed the sentence based on phrases from his previous letters, creating the conclusion that 40 years of searching had finally made possible. During the service, several parishioners shared specific memories of Father Andres's impact on their lives. A man in his 70s spoke about how the priest had helped him find work when political blacklisting had made employment difficult. A woman in her 60s recalled how Father Andres had counseled her through a difficult marriage, always emphasizing the importance of dignity and safety while respecting her commitment to her faith. Most powerfully, Pablo Hernandez spoke about the lesson he had learned from Father Andres's disappearance itself, that bearing witness to injustice sometimes required accepting personal risk, that speaking truth to power might cost everything, but remain necessary for the preservation of human dignity. He knew, Pablo said, his voice carrying across the church with the authority of someone who had thought deeply about these questions for 4 decades. Maybe not specifically what would happen to him, but he understood that his ministry was taking him into dangerous territory, and he continued anyway, because he believed that love required courage, that faith demanded action, that some things were worth dying for. The service concluded with the singing of Venceremos, the song that had become an anthem of hope during the Allende years and a symbol of resistance during the dictatorship. Father Andrés had reportedly led his congregation in singing this song during his final masses, despite, or perhaps because of, its political associations. As the participants prepared to leave the church, Carmen experienced a sense of completion that had eluded her for 40 years. She had finally visited the place where her brother had lived and worked, had met the people whose lives he had touched, had participated in a memorial that honored both his ministry and his sacrifice. But more than closure, Carmen felt a renewed sense of purpose. The search for her brother was over, but the work of preserving his memory and continuing his ministry of justice and compassion was just beginning. The truth had been found not just for her benefit, but for the benefit of everyone who had loved Father Andrés and whose lives had been shaped by his brief but powerful presence in their community. The return to San Miguel had transformed Carmen's relationship with her brother's memory from one of searching to one of stewardship. She was no longer just a sister seeking answers about a disappeared brother, but a guardian of a legacy that belonged to an entire community and to the broader struggle for human rights and social justice in Chile. 2 months after the memorial service at Santa Teresa, Carmen Morales made her final pilgrimage to Santiago, not to search for answers about her brother's fate, but to visit the site where Father Andrés had spent his last days alive. The memorial at Melipilla had been established in 1995, 10 years after the end of the dictatorship, on land that had once housed one of the regime's most secretive detention centers. Where buildings designed for torture and execution had once stood, a simple garden now grew, tended by families of the disappeared and marked by a granite wall bearing the names of those who had died there. Elena Vasquez accompanied Carmen on this journey, understanding that visiting the place where her brother had died might require emotional support that only someone familiar with the complexities of such pilgrimages could provide. They traveled together in Elena's small car, following roads that wound through the agricultural valleys west of Santiago, past vineyards and orchards that had witnessed both the beauty and horror of Chilean history. The memorial site occupied a hillside overlooking the Maipo Valley, with views of the snow-capped Andes that created a landscape of almost overwhelming beauty. Carmen stood at the entrance for several minutes, trying to reconcile the peaceful setting with the knowledge of what had occurred there 4 decades earlier. The contrast between natural beauty and human cruelty seemed to capture something essential about Chile itself, a country where stunning landscapes had provided the backdrop for both transcendent art and unspeakable violence. The memorial was organized around a central plaza paved with stones bearing the names of the disappeared. Carmen searched among hundreds of names until she found the simple inscription, Andrés Morales Herrera, Sacerdote, 1939-1973. Seeing her brother's name carved in stone, officially acknowledged as a victim of state terror, provided a form of recognition that had been denied for 40 years. But more moving than the formal memorial was the evidence of ongoing remembrance that surrounded it. Fresh flowers had been placed beside many of the names, photographs were propped against the granite wall, and personal notes were tucked into small crevices in the stone. The site was clearly a living memorial, visited regularly by people who refused to let the memory of the disappeared fade into historical abstraction. Carmen had brought her own offering, a small wooden cross that Andrés had carved during his seminary years, a simple piece that had decorated his desk in Valparaiso before he departed for his assignment in Santiago. She placed the cross beside his name, understanding that this gesture represented both an ending and a beginning, the end of her search for truth about his fate, and the beginning of her commitment to ensuring that his memory contributed to the broader work of justice and reconciliation. As she knelt beside the memorial wall, Carmen finally spoke aloud the words she had been carrying for 40 years. "Forgive me, Andrés, for taking so long to find you. Forgive me for the years I spent angry at God, angry at the church, angry at a country that could make people disappear as if they had never existed. I understand now that you didn't disappear. You were taken. You were murdered. But you never disappeared. You lived on in the memories of people whose lives you touched, in the questions you planted in a young soldier's conscience, in the faith you modeled for parishioners who carried your lessons forward through decades of fear and silence." Elena Vasquez remained at a respectful distance, allowing Carmen the privacy to process emotions that had been building for 4 decades. But she could see that this final pilgrimage was providing Carmen with something that the discovery of truth at the museum had begun. Not just closure, but transformation. Carmen was no longer defined primarily by her search for her missing brother, but by her role as keeper of his memory and witness to his values. The afternoon was spent walking through the memorial garden, reading the stories of other families who had lost loved ones to the detention center, understanding that Father Andrés' fate had been shared by hundreds of others, whose only crimes had been their commitment to social justice, their opposition to military rule, or their simple misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Carmen met several other family members who were visiting the memorial that day, recognizing in their faces the particular expression of people who had learned to carry grief as a form of love, who had transformed loss into commitment to ensuring that such losses never occurred again. These conversations provided Carmen with a sense of community that had been missing from her solitary search. She was part of a larger group of people who understood the weight of living with disappeared loved ones. As evening approached, Carmen and Elena prepared to return to Santiago. But before leaving the memorial site, Carmen participated in a ritual that had developed spontaneously among families of the disappeared. The lighting of a small candle beside each name on the memorial wall, creating a field of flickering light that honored the dead while affirming the persistence of memory. Standing among hundreds of small flames as darkness settled over the valley, Carmen felt a presence she had not experienced since her brother's disappearance. Not the physical presence she had longed for during 40 years of searching, but a spiritual presence that spoke of continuity rather than ending, of love that persisted beyond death, of faith that survived even the worst efforts to destroy it. "I know what I have to do now," Carmen told Elena as they drove back toward Santiago through the darkness. "I have to make sure that people remember not just what happened to Andrés, but why it happened, what he stood for, how his life and death connect to the broader struggle for human rights in Chile." Elena nodded, understanding that Carmen had reached the conclusion that many families of the disappeared eventually reached, that truth about the past was meaningful only if it contributed to justice in the present and prevention of similar horrors in the future. The search for Father Andrés had ended, but the work of honoring his memory through continued commitment to the values he had died defending was just beginning. The following week, Carmen Morales returned to Valparaiso with a new sense of purpose. She donated her extensive files about her brother's case to the Museum of Memory, ensuring that her 40-year investigation would be preserved for future researchers. But she also began working with the parish of Santa Teresa to establish an annual memorial service for Father Andrés, understanding that his legacy belonged to the community he had served rather than exclusively to his family. More significantly, Carmen began speaking at schools and universities about her brother's life and disappearance, using his story to educate young Chileans about the costs of political repression and the importance of protecting democratic institutions. Her presentations always concluded with the same message: "My brother died because he believed that love required courage, that faith demanded action, that silence in the face of injustice was a form of complicity." These lessons are not historical artifacts. They are challenges that every generation must face. In her small apartment overlooking the Pacific, Carmen replaced the photographs and documents related to her search with materials related to her new work. Letters from students who had been moved by her presentations, invitations to speak at human rights events, correspondence with other families of the disappeared who were working to ensure that their loved ones' sacrifices contributed to a more just society. The notebook where she had recorded 40 years of dead ends and disappointments remained on her kitchen table, but its final entry had been joined by new entries documenting a different kind of work. October 15, 2013, spoke to students at Universidad Católica about Andrés' ministry and sacrifice. Afterward, a young woman approached me to say that she wants to study theology, to serve poor communities as her vocation. Andrés would be proud. On quiet evenings, Carmen would sit by her window and watch the ships moving across the horizon, but now she saw them differently, not as distant symbols of escape or connection, but as reminders that truth, like love, could travel vast distances and arrive when it was most needed. Her brother's story had traveled from a secret journal kept by a conflicted soldier to an archive maintained by dedicated historians, to a memorial service attended by people whose lives had been touched by a young priest's brief ministry. The search for Father Andrés Morales was over, but his story continued, in the memories of parishioners who had carried his lessons forward through decades of fear, in the conscience of a soldier who had documented truth when documentation was dangerous, in the archives where his testimony would be preserved for future generations, and in the ongoing work of his sister to ensure that his sacrifice contributed to the broader struggle for human rights and social justice. In the end, Father Andrés had not disappeared at all. He had been transformed, becoming part of the collective memory of a people who refused to forget, who understood that the disappeared could only truly vanish if those who loved them stopped telling their stories, stopped fighting for truth, stopped working to ensure that love and justice eventually triumph over hatred and oppression. The mystery of what had happened to Father Andrés Morales on September 11, 1973, had finally been solved. But the deeper mystery, how a young priest's life and death could continue to inspire courage and compassion 40 years later, remained as profound and powerful as ever, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the ultimate victory of love over fear.